So, what the heck is philosophy anyway? I'll try to explain this a bit by considering philosophy as a field of study. That is, how professional academic philosophers look at their discipline. I like to call this a map of philosophy. You should take notes during this and pause the video whenever you need to. You might even want to go back a few times, or even watch it more than once. First, the word itself helps us understand a bit about what philosophy is all about. It's from the ancient Greek. Philo means the love of. Sophia means wisdom. So philosophia means the love of wisdom. That's not really all that helpful, I suppose. Think of philosophy as the study of a certain kind of foundational question using a rigorous method intended to clarify and explain important parts of the world and our experience of it. We'll talk about that kind of question with our first reading by the Beardsleys, and we'll be working on that rigorous method all through the course. With that in mind, let's look at the way the discipline of philosophy is usually divided up by philosophers. Each of these things will be discussed more fully in following pages, and you will be tested on this stuff. The most fundamental area of philosophy is logic, or reasoning. This has been described as the study of the rules of inference and the art of non-contradictory identification. You can think of it as the study of being reasonable. In logic, we worry about making good inferences. That is, given some set of things which are true or which we suppose might be true, what conclusions can we draw or infer? Logic is foundational for civilization, even for just a society. You can't even get along with other human beings without logic, let alone have a civilization, science, or medicine. Unless you're prepared to force people to do what you want all the time, you're not going to get very far if you can't persuade them. And to persuade them, you're going to have to be reasonable. You're going to need logic. The next area is epistemology, which is easily the hardest word you'll need to learn in this unit. Epistemology is the study of how we should go about learning things, both about the world and ourselves. And I mean how we should go about learning things very generally, learning anything. This is not about how we do learn things so much, but how we should learn to make sure that we're getting good results. When we've learned things, we want to say that we know them, but that seems to mean that knowing things is possible. But maybe there are problems with that. You might think you know what it means to know something. You don't. Nobody does. At least no one has yet been able to give a really persuasive account of what knowing something comes to. Epistemologists worry a lot about this. Every other area of inquiry relies upon some epistemic principles. For example, you may have heard of the scientific method. That's applied epistemology. Philosophers worked out that the method of hypothesis testing that we call the scientific method was a better way to come up with good explanations of natural phenomena than any of the other options. So applying epistemology, and of course logic, philosophers came up with the scientific method. Like logic, you can't do science, education, or even just investigative journalism without epistemology. And like logic, you might not have realized you were using epistemology all this time. It's a bit harder to get a handle on metaphysics. It is definitely not what bookstores usually mean when they put books in a metaphysical section. Metaphysics worries about such things as what kinds of things exist. Is everything that exists physical stuff? Are there also mental things? Spiritual? What does it mean for something to exist anyway? Clearly you and I exist, but do fictional characters exist? Do numbers exist? Not numerals, mind you, but numbers. What about abstract principles like freedom or fascism? Do those exist? And if so, how is their existence different from ours? Does something like a God exist? Do people have free will? Are all persons human beings, and are all humans persons? Are they necessarily so? If there is a God, can we say anything about what it must be like? That is, if it's God. This is the most controversial area of philosophy. Of course, there are controversial issues and positions in each of the areas, even logic, but many philosophers think we shouldn't even bother with any of these metaphysical questions. These philosophers have several objections, starting with the thought that we can never be confident that we've ever actually answered any of the questions. While I understand these concerns, I think they're exaggerated. At the very least, using logic and a lot of effort, we can rule out some answers as not making sense. Value theory is the most obviously practical area of philosophy. The basic idea is that this is where we sort out what is most important, most of value, and try to give a reasonable account of why it's so important. Then we need to know what we ought to do about what's so important. Historically speaking, there are three main areas of value theory. The first is arguably the most important area in all of philosophy, ethics. This is the study of what is most important in human life, both individually and together. How should we treat each other? What is the most important thing in human life? And of course, as always, why should we treat each other that way, and why is that so important? Santa Fe offers a whole course on ethics, and I strongly recommend it. Politics is the study of how we ought to organize ourselves as a society more largely considered. What's the right or best way to organize a state? Why? Political science is largely just the application of this area of philosophy to historical and contemporary cases. Aesthetics is the philosophy of art and beauty. What is art anyway? Is beauty really just in the eye of the beholder? Why or why not? Art is very important to human life. If you know someone who says they don't like art, they're either broken or they're confused about what counts as art. Aesthetics doesn't worry so much about why art happens to be so important to humans. That's psychology, anthropology, or sociology. As much as worrying about what makes something art and how we ought to think about what makes some of it good and some of it awful. The last area of philosophy we'll be covering is what I like to call applied philosophy. The basic idea here is that there is an area of applied philosophy that deals with the fundamental ideas and methodology of the field in question. As an example, let's consider some of the questions asked in the philosophy of medicine. What's medicine for exactly? You might say to cure the sick, but what about actively promoting health? Some people actually think the purpose of medicine is to make money. That seems clearly wrong to most people, but why is it wrong? What counts as healthy? Is a blind person healthy? A deaf person? Some people think there are easy answers to these questions. These people are, to use the technical term, wrong. Okay, fine, but surely we know what a disease is. Nope. There is no consensus whatsoever as to what it means for something to be a disease. And this is not an issue you can just do science on to figure out. It's a conceptual issue, a philosophical issue. Moving on to ethical considerations, we have questions about the role of doctors and other healthcare providers, as well as questions about what it is reasonable for patients to expect. All of these things are things doctors and nurses have some position on, even if it's just a kind of vague background assumption. Conflicts about these things happen all the time. The thing is, though, that we can't expect healthcare providers to provide answers to these things, though we should ask for their help. It's just not their job to deal with these things. It's a job for philosophy. Before moving on, let's look at how these questions relate to the four main areas of philosophy over on the left. What's medicine for is a question about what important role does medicine serve. That word important suggests that what we're looking at is a value judgment. So naturally, we're looking at an application of value theory. What counts as healthy is asking a question that obviously depends on what healthy means. We need to understand what is necessary and sufficient for a human to be healthy. This is wondering about something essential to the nature of humans. So it's a metaphysical question about human beings, or whatever the patient is. Props to veterinary medicine majors and zoo students. Similarly, what's a disease exactly is asking about the essential characteristics of this kind of thing. So it's a metaphysical question about disease. Of course, that's assuming that there is such a thing out there in the world. Some might say that there isn't, but that it's just an idea we have that we use to organize stuff in the world. However, this itself is a metaphysical position, sometimes called nominalism. As I said before, the last two questions are fundamentally ethical questions, and since ethics is part of value theory, These questions are for philosophers working in value theory. It's important to note that if we're going to take any answers to any of these questions seriously, they must be reasonable. We need to have good arguments to support the answer someone gives to the question. So any attempt to answer any question must respect and involve the area of logic. That is, any question at all, not just philosophical ones. We shouldn't take any answer to any question seriously if there isn't a good, reasonable argument to support it. Of course, that is unless it's just a trivial answer to a trivial question, like red is my favorite color, or I want Tijuana Flats for lunch. Asking for a logical argument to support such an answer would be silly and cost you your friends. Before we move on, take a moment to consider which area of philosophy is involved in considering this question. How should a doctor go about figuring out what's wrong with a sick patient? Go ahead and pause this to give yourself a minute to think about it. If you said epistemology, you've got the hang of this, or at least you seem to. If you didn't get epistemology, you might want to watch this video again. All of these are well-respected and very active fields of philosophical inquiry, and all fall under applied philosophy. Two of them, philosophy of language and philosophy of mathematics, are, for my money, the deepest, darkest waters of philosophy. That's some difficult stuff to get your head wrapped around. The biggest brains in philosophy seem drawn to these two areas and to logic. Notice the wide range of topics covered here. I have yet to come across a field or a major that doesn't have an associated philosophy of that's applicable to it. At the very least, there's going to be an ethics of it to ask the questions about how people doing that thing should go about it to avoid being rotten bastards or the like. Next, we'll look at each of these 5 areas in a bit more detail. For each one, working up the list on the left, there will be a Canvas page for you to read, and then there will be a quiz. When you've done all 5 of those quizzes, we'll move on to the first reading from the book.